Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
My feelings about large corporations go back to the age of 18, where I was packing chocolates at Terry's in York. It's sort of fashionable to knock large corporations, but the truth is that all of us consume their electricity, we drink their water, we fly in their planes, we buy their insurance. And although one can argue that large corporations are doomed, there isn't any evidence of that. There's no evidence that large corporations are getting smaller or there's fewer of them. In fact, there's more of them and they're getting larger. So what expectations can we have of them? We live in a world which is changing very fast, and that's been actually the focus of my research now for 10 years. For 10 years, I've been working with people from a whole bunch of companies, and these are they, about the future of work. And what's interesting, I think, about this research consortium that I've been leading is it's both international, and that's important because some of the most interesting ideas are coming from places in the world you wouldn't have expected. And it covers different sectors. And that's also interesting because different sectors have different ways of looking at the world. Now, when we think about the future, there's lots of ways of talking about it. But I have specifically talked about and described these trends. And just to pull a few of them out, I mean, what we know about the future is incredible levels of connectivity. What we know about the future is profound changes in the nature of work, particularly what some have called the hollowing out of work, which sees most medium-skilled jobs either being outsourced or being replaced by technology. A future where the world that we've produced is now creating problems both in terms of poverty and in terms of climate change. And when you think about that, when I think about that, I asked two questions. One was, what would I tell my children? What would I advise my kids and my friends? And the second is, what would I say to corporations? What would we say to Unilever? What could one say to Arm? What would one say to Tata Consulting Services? And it seems to me that all that one can say, and by the way, it's the same as you say to people, is it's about resilience. We don't know what the future is going to be, but what we do know is it's going to change faster than anything that's happened before. And we do know that large institutions have an enormously important role to play. Now, it's easy to diss them. It's easy to say they're greedy, they're short-term, and all those things are true. But it's much more than that, because actually large institutions are made up of people like you and I. In fact, some of you in this audience work for a large corporation, and you care about life, you care about the world, you care about things. I'm a humanistic psychologist. I believe that most of us are good, and I think most of us want to be in corporations that do good. And rather than dissing them, my question would be, can we ask more of you? And that's really where I come out in terms of preparing for the future. So what might we ask of companies? Well, I'm formulating it in three ways. First of all, we can ask businesses that they help every single person within their organization to be the best they can be and to be as resilient as they can be. It seems to me that there are three things that make every one of us resilient. One of those things is about the way we think about, the way we develop ourselves intellectually in terms of our wisdom. The second is about the way we keep ourselves emotionally strong and vital, incredibly difficult in today's world, you know, when so many of us are under such levels of stress. And the third is about how we connect with each other, because we know that innovation, a number of you in this room are fascinated by innovation, Innovation comes through connectivity. It comes through different people connecting together and having great ideas. So how do companies do that? Well, let me give you some ideas about what I see. So here's Tata Consulting Services, a company that currently employs 360,000 people and that grows at 20% a year. This is a serious player. And what Chandra, who runs TCS, has said is, I want everyone to be connected to every single person, and I would like ideas to flow. He is actually achieving that. I mean, there are 3,000 communities of people in TCS who are talking to each other. There are 40,000 people who are coming in every day to talk. Next year, he's going to ban email. Why? Because email is hierarchical. He's actually going to say, I want everybody to talk to everybody else. I don't want it to be a hierarchy. So, number one, let's think about how we really build the wisdom of the crowd, something we've been talking about for years but have never been able to achieve. Number two, let's think about emotional vitality. You know, one thing that I notice, I teach at London Business School, so I teach both MBAs and executives. Levels of stress are really high. That's not just about big business. Anybody who's working these days is stressed. So, and what we know is that people who are stressed are less resilient. That's a big deal if you think you're going to live 100 years, which many of our children will. We've got to find a way of dealing with that. We've got to find a way of creating work that isn't so exhausting. How do you do that? Well, again, here's an idea. Here's W.L. Gore, and you don't know the name, but you probably know Gore-Tex, which has said, let's really think about vitality in our organization. Let's really think about how you would give people time to do innovative, creative things. We can create places where people feel vital, where people feel energized. It is possible for us to do that. And we can also create places with high levels of connectivity. Here's a company you may not have heard of. It's based in California. It's called Morningstar. It is the largest packer of tomatoes in the world. What does it do? Well, it actually uses social networks as a way of thinking about how work gets done. And the picture I have up here shows people, shown here as colored dots, and the commitments they've made to each other about what they're going to do. This isn't a hierarchy, although there are leaders and there are tasks and there are goals, but this is an organization which is connecting people with each other. These things are possible, and every one of us now needs to say to large corporations, who I think are not going to disappear, these are some of the things that you can do. Is that enough? Well, as you begin to think about the future, what's clear is that couldn't possibly be where you stopped. It couldn't possibly be where the job finishes. And the job doesn't finish there. The job also goes right into the community. And it really says, what are you doing in your community to anchor yourself, both in your community and in your supply chain? And corporations around the world are working hard to do that. We can just look down the road at John Lewis Partnership, one of the UK's iconic corporations, and by the way, increasingly admired around the world, both in terms of the way it set itself up as partnership owned, and indeed in terms of the way it's balanced, how it tries to create social good with its capacity to remain economically vibrant. It's a very fascinating case right now. And here's John Lewis Partnership that says, the community really matters to us. It's not just about what happens in our office. It's not just about what happens in our factories. It's also about what happens in our community and what happens in our supply chain. But does it end there? Now, the global challenges that we face are obvious to everyone. We have produced a society where the difference between the rich and the poor is extraordinary. We have produced a world where many young people, particularly in some of the European countries, are unemployed, and we know the impact that that has on their long-term health and vitality. Climate change, I think, is now understood by everyone. I don't think there's anybody now around the world who would be skeptical about that. Now, whose job is that to do something about it? When you look at the candidates, the stakeholders, they are many and various. And of course, one can look and say it's all about government. I mean, why can't government do something about that? But what we know is that governments are based in countries. They don't go across countries. And they are constantly, if they're a democracy, beholden to short-term voter sentiments. You could say, well, what about NGOs? Well, NGOs are brilliant, but at the same time, they find it very difficult to scale. You could say, well, what about citizens? Well, of course, citizens can join themselves together, but do they have the resources? Now, I'm not saying that the world's problems can be solved by large corporations, by big business. But what I am saying is that we can and should hold them accountable for some of these issues and ask them to help. Because if any of these issues are going to be solved, and the chances, as we know, are slim because they're so complex, they will be solved because people build alliances. And one of the key parts of that alliance are large corporations, like some of the ones that you work with. Now, what is it that companies can do? Well, it's easy to say they can give money, they can give time. I don't think that's enough. If you are thinking about the strategy of corporations, then you know that there is such a notion of core competencies. The idea that corporations, when they get large, usually get large because they're good at something. And typically, they're good at one of three things. You know, some of them are brilliant at innovation. Google, for example. Some of them are incredible at scaling and mobilizing. Take Unilever, for example. Some of them are very good at building alliances. You know, the alliances that the telecom industry builds are some of the most complex ecosystems in the world. Why can't they use those capabilities to make a difference to the problems of the world? Well, they are beginning to do that. And let me give you some examples. Now, I'm not saying that this is enough, and I'm not saying it's going to solve all the problems, but it is the beginning. And let's take a look at what some of those beginnings are. Here's Google, who knows through its networks where some of the people who are working in gang violence live, and who are reaching out to them to encourage people in gangs to leave gangs and to become non-violent. And they have, over years now, built, in a pretty low-key way, a network of people who have left violent gangs to help others do the same. Here's Standard Chartered Bank, who many years ago said, one of the things in developing countries like Africa that creates problems is blindness. When a member of a family is blind, it has a massive economic impact. Could we do something about that? Well, they have enormous scaling and mobilizing capabilities. You know, they have retail banks all over Africa and Asia, for example. Since they made that promise, they and their NGO partners have saved the sight of more than 31 million people. That's a lot of people, and that's because Standard Chartered Bank are brilliant at scaling and mobilizing. Or let's take Partners in Food Solutions, which is a whole alliance made, by the way, of competing companies who are working together using technological platforms to share their best practices and to work with NGOs who are working on food and food sustainability. Now, what does that mean for leadership? Of course, for me, that's a really important question because I teach MBA students, and some of them will become leaders. And so I've had to address that in my own thinking and indeed in my own teaching. I want to make two points before I finish. Number one, it's hard to be a leader right now. I asked my MBA class some years ago, how many of you want to be CEOs? There weren't that many raised hands in the audience. These are tough jobs. But I think there's something one can do to help the development of them. And basically, what I want to suggest is through the toughness that they face, there are two areas that I think are absolutely crucial in terms of what it means to be a leader. Number one is about the leader's relationship with themselves. I call that the inner journey. How do they think about themselves? How do they think about the decisions they're going to make? And we are beginning to see around the world organizations that are thinking very hard about the way a leader thinks about themselves. And that, in a sense, is about authenticity. Because if you're running a company, you're under enormous pressure. You're going to be asked to make decisions all the time. How do you do that and still hold on to your values? Well, you do it because your values are strong and they're embedded, and that's about authenticity. But that's a sort of an inward-looking focus. It seems to me that the second major focus is what we might call the outer journey. And by the outer journey, I mean, how is it that people who will be leading our organizations, either as CEOs or as business heads or as business leaders, how do they understand the world that they live in? How do they understand the challenges they face? How do they understand the stakeholders that are involved? How do they make a decision about the systems that they're creating? And those things, building authenticity through their own knowledge and through the sort of experiences that act as crucibles, creating a worldview in terms of their foresight and in terms of their understanding of alliances, I believe is what leadership will be increasingly about. And I want to finish today by saying it's easy to knock corporations, and yet at the same time, we use them every moment of the day, constantly. So rather than knocking them, why don't we ask more of them?